coronavirus pandemic will cause the worst global economic fallout since the Great Depression almost a century ago. That was the warning today from the head of the International Monetary Fund.
Data releases each day are underscoring the economic havoc wreaked on Britain and the world economy by the coronavirus lockdown. After the virus hit Wuhan in the Chinese province of Hubei, supply chains around the world felt the repercussions of factory workers being quarantined to contain the spread of the outbreak. The demand side was also squeezed as China locked down entire regions, stopping people going to shops, restaurants and bars, and travelling within and out of the country. As the virus spread and the death toll climbed, its hold on the global economy tightened. Businesses have shut, millions of workers have lost their jobs and had their wages cut, and savers and pensioners have watched their money diminish as stock markets tanked. Central banks responded by printing money and cutting interest rates to record lows, while governments have delivered fiscal stimulus packages to keep companies afloat and cash in people's pockets.
Office for Budget Responsibility recently forecast that the second quarter decline in GDP would be something in the order of 35%, which has to be the most extreme collapse in economic activity that any of us have seen in our lifetimes.
The longer we are operating at reduced or indeed much reduced capacity, the more initial economic damage there will be, and the less likely we are to be able to make up for it.
Some people have compared it to putting a patient into an induced coma. The economy has been put to sleep. So that gives some hope to believe that once this is all over, the economy can begin to bounce back. So you just have to keep people going as long as it takes to get on top of this pandemic.
Virologists had been predicting that globalisation would lead to a viral pandemic for years. Just as trains, planes and automobiles carry workers and their wallets, so too could they carry a deadly virus. But should this inevitably mean that our modern way of life is bound to fail too? Could we even fathom a less convenient world with more limited choice and less freedom? For many, the arrival of Covid-19 is a crisis unlike any other in modern times, and that could potentially change the way we live and how we run our economies.
The longer the lockdown goes on, the more chance there is of lasting damage to the economy, what economists call a scarring. And this is because quite a lot of businesses will become insolvent. This will finish off, I imagine, large swathes of the high street. That's got big knock-on repercussions in the property market, and what on earth do you do with all these shops? They can't all be restaurants and coffee bars and pubs.
But this isn't our first pandemic, and the great plagues of history also wreaked economic havoc. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century killed tens of millions and meant the Romans had less manpower to protect their empire. There was a decline in agriculture and trade, which led to spiralling inflation and contributed to Rome's downfall. The Black Death in the 14th century killed up to 2/3 of Europe's population, but as a consequence there were fewer labourers to work the land, so their wages and bargaining power increased, contributing to the breakdown of the feudal economy and culminating in the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. But as the population grew, in some parts of Europe incomes fell again, as observed by Thomas Malthus. As he saw it, there was a natural correcting force. Then, the Great Plague of London in the 17th century killed a quarter of the capital's population and cracked down on trade. But the Great Fire that followed it actually stimulated growth as the city had to be rebuilt. And in the 20th century, the Spanish flu came in 3 waves, which focuses minds now to prepare for the potential next bout of the coronavirus, which might be even deadlier than this one. So, what should we do differently this time?
As we look to the future and how to come out of this crisis, we'll obviously be balancing the need to get our medical response right. There are really 3 stages to think about. There's the immediate stage, which is making sure that all these promises we have made about compensation for people's incomes that have been hit are actually delivered and that money gets to people's pockets as soon as possible. Then there's the phase where the government will need to think very hard about how it unwinds some of these schemes, how we start to return our economy to normality. That will mean how restrictions are eased off on activity, but also how that fits with removing the schemes. And then there's a third pure recovery phase where we need to move into more standard economic approaches to how to make sure that we're getting that demand in the economy to make up some of this lost ground.
We will end up with a bigger state. There'll be a lot of pressure for more spending on health in particular, all kinds of preventative measures which have been shown wanting during this crisis. We've been caught very much with our trousers down. We may see an advance towards much more widespread wealth taxes in particular. Governments will look at who is capable of paying taxation. Plainly, it's not the low paid or the unemployed. They will focus very much on very wealthy individuals.
Some say that out of a crisis can come collaboration, innovation and fresh thinking. Just months ago, the idea of a universal basic income seemed radical, but now Western governments are flirting with it. And many are now asking how concerned the public really is with all the government's borrowing.
We've not seen a government having to essentially directly manage the economy and society since the Second World War. This is new. They're really running the country. They're not just saying they're running the country while essentially letting everything be as it is or as it always was.
After the war, obviously the UK economy emerged with excessive debt. It was 270% of GDP, I think it got to. Now, the way in which they dealt with that debt, which I think is really interesting and happened really under Tory administrations rather than Labour ones, was that they whacked up inheritance tax to 80%, I think it was, at the peak. I don't think they're going to whack up inheritance tax, but there are going to be wealth taxes coming through without a shadow of a doubt.
For those who can do it, working from home has meant meetings replaced by video conferences, thanks to high-speed broadband. If offices were the factories of the 20th century, for many, the home might be the workplace of the 21st, saving firms money on rent, utilities and furniture. According to the TUC, more than 4 million Britons were already working from home before the coronavirus, and 4 million more would like the option after. More flexible working could enable parents to more easily juggle childcare and work, and by reducing the time we spend commuting, CO2 emissions could be massively reduced. Research shows that pre-COVID, Britons spent an average of 10.5 days commuting each year.
So we are seeing the world's biggest experiment in home working, but some of the predictions that it will lead to kind of firms shutting their offices entirely, I think, are overrated, because although IT does make working from home easier, actually there are other benefits from people being in physical proximity. We are human beings and people need social contact.
The idea that the office will just vanish as a phenomenon seems to me rather unlikely. People like to meet. It's much more easy to have a proper meeting in which proper decisions are made in a face-to-face context. So there may be more working from home on a part-time basis. Maybe people will only come into the office 3 or 4 days a week rather than 5 days a week. There may be more of that. A lot of sectors, they're very physical. You have to be at the place of work in order for it to function at all. You can manage a warehouse from home, but you cannot man it from home. So I suspect that consequence won't be quite as big as some people seem to think it might be.
For lots of lower earners, working from home isn't a thing. If you work in a shop or a restaurant, there isn't a work from home option. You've either seen your income disappear entirely if your restaurant has closed down, or if you work in a food retail store, you've been working very hard in your store during this crisis. So for low earners, working from home in general is much less likely, almost 5 times less likely to be an option.
It's not only because people are working from home that air pollution's falling. Airlines are cancelling flights, companies are scrapping travel, and industrial production has collapsed. All this has meant that carbon emissions are at levels only a few months ago climate activists could have only dreamt of reaching by 2050. Maps of air pollution over countries have changed colour. raising the question, as economies are able to return to capacity following the crisis, what economic changes could we make to safeguard the environment better? Some say that when all this blows over, we'll return to our old, individualistic, consumerist ways with renewed vigour. It was hardly encouraging that thousands of shoppers ignored the advice not to panic buy, and thousands more ignored advice to stay home, leading to the official lockdown. Some businesses took advantage of the situation, hiking prices on goods they knew would be in demand as people holed themselves up. Workers at Sports Direct, for example, revealed plans to increase the price of some home fitness items by 50% overnight. Tim Martin, the Wetherspoons boss, said his staff should find work at Tesco. The outbreak of the pandemic has sparked a fresh debate around the nature of our globally connected economies.
We're going to see lots of countries getting into trouble. They're going to be trying to raise money from international financial markets at a time when investors want to hold on to cash. As the Northern Hemisphere possibly emerges from the worst of this crisis, just as the Southern Hemisphere is going into elements of it, they need to step up to their responsibilities and make sure that we are there to help with the kind of support that we've been able to deliver in the developed world.
The idea that we should grow more of our own food and manufacture more of our own vaccines to reduce our dependence on countries like China is perhaps attractive when we think that without open borders, the contagion might have been stopped. But localised production has its own vulnerabilities: bad harvests, natural disasters, and vermin. Before the crisis, Tony Blair said arguing against globalisation was about as sensible as arguing against the seasons.
The other trend, which is likely to be very much accelerated by this pandemic, is the move towards more self-reliance in economies. And for the last 40 years, we've had growing globalization and integration. This has woken governments up to the security risks of having these long supply chains. Not just governments, but it's companies too, which will be encouraged to essentially onshore a lot more production than we've been used to in recent decades.
I think we were on trend to reduce globalization. We were seeing greater national feeling, like greater emphasis on countries. We were seeing that from the US, we were seeing that in China, we were arguably seeing that in the UK as well. And then you get a pandemic which needs to be tackled globally.
One of the big complaints about economic trends in recent years is that some of the jobs that gave a sense of community and importance, they've all disappeared, they've all been offshored, and we've been left with these, for want of a better term, sort of mat jobs, in low-level service industry jobs.
Some people will say, actually, we need more global responses. Some will say we need more national responses. Some will say we need more state intervention. Some will say we need more capitalism. I'm not sure there's a clear answer as to which way that will go. I am very wary of those who say this will mean that in the future, after this happens, there will be big changes. I think that is very much contested space. I think people will take different views. There'll be a lot of economic rebuilding to do, clearly, because this will cost the government a lot of money.
Pandemics are often what mark new chapters in history, and Covid-19 looks to ask some critical questions of the way we live and work.
People have been assuming for too long this would feel like the financial crisis because it's so fresh in our mind, but actually it's very different. It's very different in terms of who has been hit first and hardest. This crisis is hitting lower earners first because they work in those big employment heavy sectors that across the world have been most affected by this shutdown that we're engaging in, and they're also in other parts of our economy, the ones doing the essential work but with significant health risks. So it is a very different kind of recession, and that lesson that you should never assume a future crisis is the same as the last, hopefully, has been learned.
When the virus passes, as it will inevitably, will we see the return of capitalism with a vengeance?
I've seen quite a lot of crises in my time. In all of them, it is said that this is some kind of transformational event, and it will be transformational on many levels. But I doubt that it's going to completely destroy capitalism. No, that seems to me deeply unlikely. The Spanish flu pandemic That was not so dissimilar to what we're going through at the moment. It was a global pandemic. It plainly had a very serious effect on the economy at the time, big contraction. But it was followed by the Roaring Twenties, something close to a boom time decade.
Although we all say this should be a V-shaped recovery in the sense that we've gone down very fast and that we should hopefully bounce back as the crisis passes, actually history tells us that isn't always the case in pandemics. It can take several years to get back to where we were, and we need to make sure we get there as quickly as possible.
Personally, I don't think we're heading into a second Great Depression, for instance, lasting the next 10 years. This seems to me quite unlikely.
To quote Albert Einstein, in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity.